may be questioning, why here comes Santa Claus? This week's talk is about immortality of our souls. And I want to make the connection between Santa Claus and immortality, eternality, continuity. The way that I want to do it is that I want to look at the Santa Claus arc, the Santa Claus story, as a model for considering our own stories, our own ways that we embody immortality. Because immortality really doesn't matter if it's something that happens sometime in the future, or if it's something that happened way in the past. Immortality is being extremely present to the here and now, and letting nothing stand in the way of that. And I believe that the Santa Claus stories gives us a powerful way to put that into practice in our own lives. So, Santa Claus. How many of us are familiar with the notion of Santa Claus? How many have seen the images of Santa Claus? How many of us may think, oh my God, Santa Claus, that is such a commercial overcharge for what this season is really about? Yada, 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 yada. What I'd like to introduce is that the stories of Santa Claus really go back far, far in time. There's some who believe that Santa Claus is an expression of Odin, or Woden, which was a Nordic god. In fact, if we look in the history books, the stories of Odin go back as far as the 6th century BC. So this is just not a flash of the pants, coming out of nowhere sort of thing. Odin was believed to be the chief rider of Yule.
What?
The chief rider of Yule. He brought forward and led the spirits at this darkest time of the year. And he was someone who delivered to people what it is that they needed. Odin was known to be the god that warriors called on so that they would have the courage to go into battle. Odin was the one who was in charge of the Valkyries. Those were the women who were able to go into battle when no one else had the courage to do so. Odin was able to influence the minds so that they could drop fear. And in its place, they could have the berserker instinct to go into battle. Now, I hear that sometimes we need a berserker instinct to go into our daily lives. Because without it, we just can be overwhelmed, overrun by what is. So I'd like us to look at that Odin story of Santa Claus as bringing us a little chunk of courage. When in ourselves we may feel empty. In ourselves we may feel that we just don't have what it takes. I mean, the middle of winter, or the beginning of winter, it starts to get pretty bleak. Have anybody noticed that the days are getting shorter? And, you know, the sunrise seems to be later and later in coming, and the sunset is earlier and earlier in arriving. And when the sun is out, it's very gray for a lot of the day. In fact, the amount of light that comes around in this part of the world has people buying sun lamps. The notion of Odin, this old figure, this old god, was the idea that no matter what the circumstances are, that we can have the courage to charge forward. That we can come into things. So, where do we look to the inner Odin in us? How do we draw on the inner Odin? Well, one of the things that Odin is credited with was the idea of creating runes. And runes are writings. Runes are ways of capturing something. A lot of the things that goes on with this holiday season, there are a number of stations that only play a certain kind of music. And they play it over and over and over again. One of the things about these musical tales is that it captures us in a story. So Odin, the inner Odin, can capture us in our own stories. What's like, I heard somebody say that they'd like to create a different story than the one that they're feeling now. I'm sure that one person here is not the only one who has had that experience. That we find ourselves trapped in a story and we don't know how to get out. Suzanne introduced me to the story of Fringe.
Oh.
And in the story of Fringe, there is this character, Olivia. And Olivia is a master of entering stories. She comes up against all kinds of circumstances and situations which are really fearful. It's the notion where science has stretched its limits, and in some cases has gone a little bit too far. And Olivia is willing to go as far as the science takes her. Olivia keeps being willing to open her heart to those full stretches. Now, one of the things about that character, Olivia, is Olivia as a character continues to change season after season. She meets this character, Walter, Dr. Walter. Walter has been in an insane asylum because Walter really can't handle much of his life. But Walter knows what's going on with the science because Walter actually is responsible for a lot of the science. So Walter becomes one of Olivia's sidekicks, but to get Walter out of the insane asylum, she needs his son, Peter. And she pulls Peter into this story. So you have this threesome. You've got Peter, and you've got Walter, and you've got Olivia. And again, I just use these stories because what happens as Olivia and Peter and Walter move forward in this story is they keep embracing it in new ways. Olivia meets Walter in season 1, but by season 3 you discovered that she's met Walter when she was a little girl. Walter had in fact introduced a science to her that had changed her in ways that she never realized or understood. How many times are we introduced to people and they may seem completely new or completely unknown to us, and yet there's a part of them that seems absolutely familiar. Now that individual person that we may be meeting, one way to characterize it is the notion of archetype. That we may encounter someone who just moves us in a certain way and who captures us. And I would say that that's what we have with that Santa Claus. That's what Olivia had with Walter. Walter pulled forth something out of Olivia. What Walter introduced Olivia to was insurmountable courage. She was someone who could face anything. Actually, in order to get in touch with her power, she had to figure out how to feel fear again so that she could figure out how to solve a particular mystery. Sometimes we segment our lives. We set part of ourselves aside, and we cut part of ourselves off. So this story of Santa going to Odin and then moving forward, because how many people here have heard Odin? You know, you've heard about him, but how many of us have actually practiced Odin kinds of things? Odin is not one of our most familiar things. We say Wednesday all the time. Woden, Odin, Wednesday, Odin's Day. So every day of the week we are encountering Odin. And yet we may not have a conscious familiarity with that. Well, what is Odin doing in the middle of our week? Sometimes the middle of our week is exactly when we need Odin. How many people have said Wednesday, hump day? Oh, if I can get through this, I can get through anything. Odin is one embodiment of the Santa Claus character. Some other ones that came up over time, many of you may have heard of the story of St. Nicholas. Now that's the one that's more obvious in terms of the connection with Santa Claus. St. Nicholas was a bishop in what's now Turkey. You know, and of course his body got moved. One part of his body got moved to one city in Italy, and another part of his body got moved to another city in Italy, because everybody wanted to have a St. Nicholas's church. And in order to have the church, you needed to have the bones. In order to have the bones, you had to have the body. So, you know, people fought over getting that body, carrying that body back. The reason that they thought that St. Nicholas was so important is that Nicholas was this incredibly generous person. St. Nicholas realized that there were children in the world that were in need. So the story of Odin was that care of the warriors. The story of St. Nicholas was the story of children whose families didn't have anything to give them. In fact, one of the most famous stories was that he provided the dowries for 3 daughters whose family were impoverished, so that they wouldn't be forced into prostitution. But again, this story of St. Nicholas and keeping those girls out of prostitution really isn't the most common thing we think about when we think of Santa Claus. And yet I bring this story into part of this thread because I'd like us to think, how is it that there's a St. Nicholas abiding in us? Just as there's an Odin abiding in us, who is perhaps encouraging us, getting us through hump day on Wednesday, how is there a St. Nicholas in us who is seeing people in need? I know Charlie has talked about people coming early in the morning to the job that he has, and that smile that he makes is that gift that they keep coming back for. How many of us are consciously embodying that St. Nicholas part of Santa Claus? Just like I would invite us to embody that Odin, courage-giving part, what will it take us to embody that St. Nicholas? What will it take to embody the ability to see the people in need? The people who are lacking the material substances. I know that working with the children as you're working with, you probably get to embody it quite a lot. And how do you just give yourself acknowledgement and praise to let that part of that loving presence come through? How do we embrace our own willingness to give? I think that's probably the most obvious connection with the Santa Claus that we have, is this part that is looking to care for these young children. This part that is looking to take care of things. Now, as many of you know, Christianity hit a split. It had been pretty much held by the Catholic faith. And then there was the Protestant Reformation. And with the Protestant Reformation, Luther came forward, and Luther hung up some statements on the church walls, on the church doors. 99. Things that he was declaring were kind of a problem with the Catholic Church, the way it was embodying things. I don't know about you, but I certainly have had my own inner Luther that will look at situations and look at systems and say, my God, this can be done better than it's being done now. And if I were king of the world, this is how I would do it. Now again, I might be so egomaniacal that I'm the only one that's ever had this notion that if I were king of the world, then this is how it should be. But if anybody ever has the slightest little tingle in themselves that if the elections could be run this way, or other things, that we might make a change. Luther came around, and one of the things that Luther really insisted on, he was not hunky-dory with all of the veneration that was given to Roman Catholic saints. every day was a Roman Catholic saint day. And he really just wanted a little bit more attention to the connection with the divine. And he thought all of this saint worship was just a little bit over the top. So one of the things that happened with the Protestant Reformation was they wanted to get rid of St. Nick's Day, which had been a great day for kids because it was a day that the children would receive presents. December 6th. 6th, I believe. 6th. December 6th, St. Nick's Day. Children would find packages. He didn't want any more of that. Luther did not want any more of that because he wanted to stop. So he suggested the movement of St. Nick's Day to Christmas Day so that we could put all of our attention on the gift from God, which was Jesus. So Father Christmas took on a much greater role, and St. Nick's, at least in Northern Europe, which had become a little bit less Catholic, Father Christmas took over where St. Nicholas, had been so powerful. So now we have this Father Christmas, and we have this Kinder Claus. We have this notion of Father Christmas coming in. Now, here's where it can get kind of uncomfortable, because a lot of times when we think about fathers, we think about stern. We don't think about somebody who is always that kind, because fathers were kind of the big bad disciplinarian.
Right.
I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, there was a cartoon called Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. And the kids would raise havoc, and the mother would tell them, wait till your father gets home, because he was the one that was going to take care of it. One of the lovely things about Father Christmas, though, was that Father Christmas was an alternative from that harsh father figure. Father Christmas gave an alternative way of identifying male fatherhood. So shifting from that inner Saint Nick, I'd like us to envision what it is to embody that generous Father Christmas. Father Christmas, actually one of the earliest drawings of Father Christmas, came with the story of A Christmas Carol and the Ghost of Christmas Present. His image is what became the image for many of Santa Claus. Father Christmas was this character who took care of people in need. If you know the story of Scrooge, Scrooge was pretty much in pretty serious need. This was a person who was so wrapped up in himself. And he was not all that eager to be sharing and generous and kind and loving. And he had lots of people in his life, some who were kind of after him. He would shoo away those people that were looking for him to give them money. And he thought his nephew was a hanger-on just because he thought his nephew wanted money. But Father Christmas took him to his nephew's home and found that his nephew was toasting him at the Christmas Eve. And he wasn't toasting him because he would get a better place on the will. He was toasting him because he remembered his relationship with his mom. He remembered that this man who had become so stern, so harsh, had at once been the loving brother of his mother. And he adored his mother. So he continued to hold in reverence his uncle the same way that his mother held her little brother in reverence. That notion of Father Christmas, how do we hold others in reverence when it's so easy to see certain things about them? Now, I have a certain someone that I have in mind that it's very easy to see anything good about. That it's not very easy to see anything good about. Starts with T, ends with ump. I just have a real hard time with some of the things that I see connected with this person. That Father Christmas inside calls me to be able to look for, or be willing to look for, something good. And it can't be, maybe he'll be shot so that someone else will take his place. That's not an example of looking for something good. How do I genuinely search for the good in people who bug me? In people who don't believe like I believe? The notion of Father Christmas is that invitation. So we've gone from Odin to St. Nicholas to Father Christmas. Santa Claus pops up in the Americas in the 1800s and the 1900s.
Dutch?
Pardon?
From the Dutch?
Well, Sinterklaas is the Dutch.
Okay.
And the notion of the fat jolly guy was Washington Irving's depiction, giving a history of New York.
Uh-huh.
He depicted him in kind of jest. It was a joke of what a Dutch sailor would look like.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
The kind of clothing that Santa Claus, that Odin, that Father Christmas, that St. Nick has worn has changed over the years. Now we're pretty much set on the notion of red coat, big belly, white furry sleeves. But over the years there's been green coats and blue coats. Actually, if you look at Christmas collections, you'll see that Santa Claus is not just as boring wearing only the red. Only the red and white. Santa wore green, Santa wore white, Santa wore blue. Santa Claus, in the American tradition, was given a story by Frank Oz. And in Frank Oz's story, Santa was born of the immortals. He was raised among the immortals, and he was introduced to humanity and saw that humanity was suffering. And he was so moved by that that he wanted to bring goodness. He was no longer willing to simply abide among the immortals, but he committed to stepping outside of that easy place where the immortals lived and to bring something better. Now, how many of us find ourselves sometimes in very easy places? In places where things are just the way they need to be. And there's really no reason to leave it. It might not happen all that often, but when it happens, it can be quite hard to want to let it go. Be quite hard to step out. What I would say really is this story of Santa Claus that Frank Vaughan taught is a retelling of the Buddha.
Christ.
No, the Santa Claus, the retelling of the Buddha.
Oh, okay.
Because the Buddha was willing to leave his palace and go forward into the world and embrace suffering. And take on suffering and own suffering. What happens when we look at our own lives in the same way we can look at this Santa life? The story of Santa. When we start to look at all of these different stories, I don't know about you, but I know that I have had a variety of different stories for my identity. I remember when I first started studying psychology, my professor was teaching me the notion of the self. And I'll tell you, I had to read the book over and over and over again to get a clue what was going on in this story. Ultimately, the idea was that the self is what can sustain our sense of identity from time to time to time to time to time to time. That it would be very easy to live as a series of disconnected events. We could just be the story of Odin, or we could just be the story of Saint Nick, or we could just be the story of Father Christmas, or we could just be the story of Santa. It's the idea of the self that brings it into wholeness. And isn't that really the notion of eternality? That there's a connection between all of these stories? So the little boy that I can remember being, waking up in the middle of the night, just before dawn, and how the light would come in and everything would change in the light. It's a very vivid memory I have. And a notion of how much light changed my world. I didn't have words to describe it, but I had this ineffable sense about the magic that was in the world around us. There's that self. And there's also the self who my parents told me about over and over again. How when I was going out with them, when they were looking for houses, I kept pulling on the realtor's pant leg, and I would say, "Hi, I'm Robbie, and I'm 2 years old." And I would do it over and over and over again, asserting my identity. How in elementary school, all the kids knew my name, and I had no clue how they knew my name. They knew who I was, and I really didn't know how, or I didn't know why. I just knew that it was that was the case. So that's early elementary school. Later elementary school, I remember making myself much more visible. I remember the reason why perhaps the older kids would have remembered me. I ran for ecology club commissioner. And as I assumed the role of ecology club commissioner, I got involved with getting our school to do ecological projects. How was it that we were going to have our school ground be ecologically sound? How was it that we were going to go out and pick up trash? How was it that we were going to be keeping our cafeteria a neater place? How was it that every teacher's desk was going to look neat? How was it that all of this was going to happen? I remember one of the teachers was none too gung-ho and had written my parents about how I should be a little bit less intrusive of my push for ecological soundness. The boy who in 8th grade spent an overnight at the seminary, feeling a real call to join the seminary, and then the seminary shut down, so I gave up that I would go to seminary for high school. But then thinking, I'm going to go to seminary for college, and the seminary shut down again.
Oh my goodness.
For the local seminary shut down again. It was no longer offering it as a college program. So this sense of continuity, that sense of self, pulling those threads together, bringing in that sense of eternality, that sense of connectedness. How do we see our own lives as connected pieces? Just as the Santa story can be connected, how do we look to connect all of the pieces of our lives? Now, sometimes there are pieces of our lives that we may not be all that thrilled to embrace. I remember when I was going through, at the beginning of my divorce from my children's mother, there are things that I did that I am not proud of. I was very upset, and I felt very helpless. I'm not proud of feeling helpless. I'm not proud of feeling like the world had done me wrong. I'm not proud of, my exclamation that Jesus had it easy hanging on a cross. He was dead pretty darn quick, but I am suffering through this. I am suffering through this a lot longer than Jesus on Good Friday. I tell it to you because as much as I wish it wasn't part of my story, it is part of my story. So there are elements of our story that we may not want to embrace or that we may not want to claim. How much of me loves the story of Santa as this mercantile genius who has this factory in the North Pole that is cramming materialism down children's throats. That's not really the story that I'm holding to as the best elements of this season. And yet it's become affixed to the Santa Claus character. A lot of people didn't want to do Santa Claus because they thought that it was created by the Coca-Cola company. He's wearing that red coat. He's wearing that red coat because that was the colors of Coca-Cola. Oh, that's what some people said.
Oh my God.
Actually, Santa was used as an advertisement for another beverage company before Coca-Cola ever came into the picture. Yeah. However, if we let those individual stories and leave them disconnected, we lose an important part of our immortal, eternal selves. Immortality, eternality, is not about where we will go someday. It's about where we are right now. So let ourselves get grounded in the pasts that we come from. Let ourselves look at the influences that those have had. Just like the Santa Claus. The Odin from centuries ago. 6 BC, 2,600 years ago, a little while. St. Nicholas, I believe it was in the 1100s, still a little while ago. Father Christmas, 1600s. Santa Claus, 1800s, through the 1900s, through the 20th century, through the 21st century. My invitation, just as we track Odin and St. Nicholas and Father Christmas and Santa Claus in our own actions and our own behaviors, how do we track our own immortal lives, giving thanks and giving more to the people we love? And so it is.